Very happy to be back here in Qatar. It's been a few years for myself. I used to do some work out here. Got to learn a lot about this area and the folks and the changes. And we've got a very exciting panel today about a topic that's constantly changing every day, really. So like the theme of this forum, AI is indeed an area in significant transition. Artificial intelligence agents have been deployed in many different industries, at times replacing humans to make decisions, or simple computer systems making poor decisions, with data-intensive AI algorithms and the promise of a better, faster, cheaper decision-making. We see it every day. We see it in the phones we carry and the decisions that are made about ourselves, about the people we know, about others. We're also seeing AI being deployed into areas for public good as well. And we're seeing that in facial recognition type technologies. We're seeing that in the military surveillance type examples. We also see a lot of risk-predictive tools being used in welfare and criminal justice systems. And with a lot of these research findings and developments, there's been a lot of risk that's also being taken on. And today we're going to talk about both the promise of AI as well as the risks that AI does bring. Some of the questions we'll try to aim with our panel here on are, how can governments and government actors and international organizations and groups, many of whom are represented here today, work together to formulate better policies and guidelines that address some of these risks? How do you start to realize some of the potential out there? And what emerging practices can best address fairness, transparency, and safety, among other things that are very important to everyone? What I'd like to do is introduce our panel of esteemed guests here, and I'll start from the far end there. We have Dr. Catherine Buscal, who comes to us, who works as a researcher at Meta, formerly known as Facebook, where she works on data governance within the organization. She's an anthropologist by training on emerging technologies and social well-being. She's briefed policymakers and scholars at all levels on the cultural dimensions of AI. Her work on the promises and perils of an accelerated future has been featured as well in TED Talks. Buscal has worked and taught in the United States and Austria, where she served as a Fulbright scholar. In addition, Buscal has performed multiple collaborations and interdisciplinary projects in the United States, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, among other places. She's got a PhD in anthropology and an MPH in epidemiology from Emory University. Welcome. Next to her is Dr. Ashande Ashaba. Dr. Ashaba is a senior researcher for fairness at LinkedIn, working at the intersection of artificial intelligence and public policy. Dr. Ashaba's research weaves together two strands: the principled application of AI and machine learning to problems in public policy, and the examination of key implications of reliance on automated decision systems. Recurring themes in his work include algorithmic equity, modeling for decision support, and modeling the behaviors of social agents. Dr. Ashaba was also a researcher at RAND in the past and remains a professor of public policy at the Pardee RAND Graduate School, where he still holds an appointment. His research portfolio is quite broad, and we're going to get into some of it today. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from USC with a dissertation on theoretical and applied methods for speeding up machine learning. Next to him is Dr. Danielle Taraf. She's the senior director at JCI Ventures, which invests in AI, cybersecurity, and energy resilience in carbon markets across the space of smart, healthy, and sustainable buildings. Prior to joining Johnson Controls, she was with the RAND Corporation as well, where Dr. Taraf advised senior decision makers on AI posture and technology strategy in the context of global competition. She's a control theorist by training, and she started her career on the electrical and computer engineering faculty at Johns Hopkins University, where she founded and led a research lab at the intersection of control and computer science. Dr. Taraf is a recipient of many different awards, NSF Career Awards, AFOSR Young Investigator, JHU Excellence in Teaching, among others. She received her degrees from Auburn in mechanical engineering and also from MIT, her PhD, and was a postdoc at MIT as well. Welcome. And last but not least, on my right here is Mr. Dilawar Syed, who is the special representative at the U.S. State Department for commercial and business affairs. He advances trade, commercial, and economic policies. He supports President Biden's commitment to promoting trade and investments that prioritize American workers and their communities by championing and advocating for U.S. businesses and entrepreneurs globally. In the Obama administration, Mr. Syed played an active role in advancing the State Department's Global Entrepreneurship Program and connecting Silicon Valley innovators with emerging entrepreneurial ecosystems all over the world. He draws from over 2 decades of experience as an entrepreneur, at one point even CEO of Lumiata at one point, and he has vast experience in global businesses across software, AI, healthcare, and consumer media. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania and a BA in economics and computer science from the University of Texas. Welcome to our panel. Thank you all for being here. Much has been said about the promise and the peril, and today what I'd like to do is get started with just some of your thoughts on what the biggest promises that exist out there for AI in the coming couple years, not looking 10 or 20 years out, but really in the next 5 to 7 years. What are the industries? What are the things that are going to happen out there? How is that going to affect people? Mr. Syed, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here right after lunch, and it's wonderful to be here at the Doha Forum. You know, before I go in, I would say this conversation has the potential to shape probably one of the most consequential topics of our lifetime. What AI represents, as you talked about, Chris, is a game changer for the world, 100 years, 200 years out. You know, in terms of the next couple of years, the promise, I think it's probably what we already see happening. Whether as consumers we are seeing how AI is speaking to us, is targeting us in all sorts of ways. We sometimes we think about stuff, and Alexa is speaking to you and saying, "Well, here's an opportunity for you." Or in the healthcare world, we're seeing a lot of innovation that has come in, especially during the pandemic. And this is where I spent some time in my previous company at Lumiata. I think a lot of that will just get better and more precise. And so that's in the couple of years. You know, I do think AI is an art and a science. It takes time for models to refine themselves and for data to be, to be harvested, if you will, in an appropriate way. I'm not sure if we'll see anything breakthrough that is at scale, but we'll just see a lot of things that we already are seeing in a stream every day. The way we communicate, the way we, commute, the way we order our food, just get better and better and more targeted, which also means we have a lot more responsibility now to make sure that the adverse impact of some of these things that you were alluding to, Chris, are properly addressed.
Danielle? Thank you. It is my first time here in Doha and the first time here at the Doha Forum, so it's a pleasure to be here. So I think, AI has the potential to supercharge pretty much every industry. Having said that, what I'm particularly excited about is the potential of AI to unlock a challenge, a global challenge that we all face, and that is the sustainability challenge. In my mind, that's an existential challenge for all humanity, the challenge to preserve our planet and to preserve our existence as a species for generations to come. And of course, it will require a lot of advances in all sorts of deep technologies. But at the end of the day, it's also the case that our resources remain limited and that we need to be able to make best use of any technologies, old and new. And that's where AI comes in order to be able to optimize our resources and make best use of them.
Shandi?
Oh, same here. First time at Doha. Nice to meet you here. Thank you for the opportunity. I think I agree with Daniel on the sustainability angle on this. I think it's going to be important to apply artificial intelligence to sustainability questions and climate change questions. But it's low on my list of things because I have a different background. There are two other things besides climate change sustainability that I think are going to benefit a lot from artificial intelligence. The first is public health. We are all living in the age of COVID, in the age of zoonotic diseases, thinking through how to apply artificial intelligence to better enable our agencies, our regulatory agencies, to respond to pandemics and other health concerns is important. And it's not just a matter of learning to see better with artificial intelligence and data, but also learning to act more efficiently in response to these diseases. The second is financial inclusion. I think it's important for artificial intelligence to to be applied to improve the inclusion of vulnerable populations across the world, particularly in the global south. Unfortunately, my thinking on that is less optimistic, because the idea of using black boxes to enable people to get credit, it sounds good in theory, but in practice I worry about the equity implications. So while I would say health, climate change, and financial inclusion are key areas where AI can help, I think for me, I personally choose health as the primary promise of AI.
Catherine?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion today. So when I'm thinking about this through the lens of an anthropologist, I am absolutely excited about the unlimited potential and realities and the ways that we can keep thinking about who we are as humans as we build tools such as the metaverse, right? I mean, that's something that I'm immersed in. And of course, we can think about that for educational purposes, recreational purposes, connection, et cetera. But the last time that I was at the Doha Forum was in December 2019, where I was speaking about global health security and in particular the risk for pandemic. So I am particularly eager to see a more concerted effort to bring in AI and informatics writ large into digital epidemiology and biosurveillance. But of course, the devil's in the details, so I'm sure we'll get into some of that.
Those are some really great examples of where the promise exists. And as we thought about those, of course, there's a lot in the news these days about where the data is coming from, the cost of setting up the computer systems, who gets access to the most advanced algorithms, who does not get access to those. So there are some downsides to the way that AI has been developing. I wonder if you could maybe, one of you could sort of step up and talk a little bit about some of these perils. Like, what are you most worried about as AI is developed over the years? Keeping in mind, a lot of people's minds go right to robots taking over the world. So how do you start to think about these AI decision-making tools that allow you to do this, but still take into consideration those perils?
Well, it would not surprise you that given that I work on fairness, I think equity is a huge, huge concern as a peril when it comes to use of artificial intelligence. I fully understand and believe, or more than believe, I understand that AI can improve economic outcomes across the world. It will increase GDP a lot. The question is who gets to have a share? How much of a share do people have to get of that increase? And you can easily imagine that entities, companies with much of the computing resources can easily put fences around those resources, and you have situations like situations in which those types of benefits don't extend to the global south. I think that's going to be a common thread.
Yeah, I would pick on that up on that absolutely, and add as well. I think one of the biggest issues that we have yet to address is one of data governance, and with that, privacy wrapped up within it. So even when we're thinking about consent to use data, how does future consent play into that? I don't think that we've actually come to a solid conclusion of how we're actually going to address issues related to future consent of one's data use. And what happens if you actually want to retract that consent, right? We don't necessarily have systems in place to do that. So that's one of my main concerns. The other is accountability over the development of models. So you might have a developer who's responsible for the actual technical specs of putting together a model, and someone who's responsible for actually deploying it and its implementation. But if things start to go awry, and inevitably they do from time to time, who's actually responsible for that? I don't think that, at least within tech companies, we've actually put together a solid protocol for addressing that. Another issue that I see is actually with respect to sustainability and capacity, massive data centers, how we're actually going to be mindful of all the data that is being amassed, and understand its carbon footprint and environmental impacts. And while it's not quite a peril, I think AI can face a shortcoming if we don't create systems to adjust to the benefits that AI can bring to the table. And I'm happy to go into that in a bit, but I'll pass it off for now. Thank you.
There's an emotional piece here. and people react in certain ways. Like, what role is fear playing in all of this?
So I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, this idea of robots taking over the world, right? I feel there is sometimes a fear-based emotional response as we see the technology evolve. I'll bring that up in a couple of different contexts. So in the context of the future of work, we hear a lot about concerns of people being displaced by the machine. And I'm not here to sort of ignore that concern. I think there is validity in that. But I would like to point out that what we are seeing at present, especially where AI meets the physical world, is that AI is being used to augment people rather than to replace them, to do things that are either tiresome, boring, ideally you don't want a person to do, or conversely to do things that a person or a group of people could not do. So you might be monitoring a central plant. There are hundreds or thousands of parameters you need to monitor. There's no single person or groups of people who could do that. Taking this a little bit further, sometimes you hear about concerns about artificial intelligence becoming more intelligent than humans, taking over the world, sort of Skynet type concerns. And if I look here with my technologist hat on, I don't even see a path from where we are, the state of the art, to get to artificial general intelligence, much less superhuman intelligence that some are concerned about. So again, I'm not trying to minimize people's fears, but I think it's important to ground the conversation in education and in a grounded discourse that is consistent with the facts and the state of technology.
So no Terminator then? Just kidding. I brought up Terminator. It has to come up in this conversation, I'm sorry. I want to add to that point and point out that fear plays a role in regulation. Like if your stakeholders, if your constituents have a narrative of fear around any technology, it doesn't have to be AI. We had the same thing with nuclear power back in the 60s, 70s. Then it affects regulation, and you end up with a jurisdiction making suboptimal decisions on regulation for whatever technology is in place. So it's not just a fear as a culture situation, it's fear as it impacts regulation in the long run.
Could I just chime in here? I think when you look at what's happened with social media, which was the one big phenomenon, I think all of us, many of us in the room right now with our devices in our hand, have seen take over our lives. We know the track record is not that great in terms of the companies regulating or already seeing what the ill effects of this of some of this media is. If I had said to you even 2 years ago that Instagram is considered an addiction for young women, you would have said, "Really? Are you sure?" It's been front page news. We had the whistleblower from Facebook, Meta, who was recognized at the State of the Union by President Biden. Why I'm bringing that example? This is what I would still consider elementary technology. It's one-dimensional. We are going into a world that is going to fundamentally change the way we do everything. And I agree with Danielle, we should not be driven by fear, but we have to be absolutely thoughtful that we cannot just leave it up to individual entrepreneurs and innovators to self-regulate. There is a role a government plays, again, thoughtfully thinking about, are there minimum viable steps you take to make sure we don't create a self-destructive situation. We again haven't yet seen all the impact that social media has had, which has been adverse to people, in addition to obviously some of the very positive impact it has had around the world. But I think in this case, just given the scale of this technology, and the other thing that I should also mention here, just the nature, having run an AI company, just the nature of an AI company, it is resource intense. You need data, lots of data. You need data scientists, lots of data scientists. You need lots of engineers. It is a world of have and have-nots. And we are going to see a world where you're going to have a fewer entities, whether it's companies or governments, having a more disproportionate control of building things at scale. And so one of the things that I think as as technologists, as product people, as consumers, as policymakers, we should think about is how do we make sure we have a world where we sort of democratize access to this next wave of technology. By the way, and that's also in the interest of big companies like Meta, because you want that innovation cycle humming. And so there's a lot to think about this. I agree with you completely. We should not be driven by fear, but we should also not just take it easy and say, well, let's just let things take its course. And just be thoughtful about this, just given the scale and given the speed at which some of these algorithms are improving and they're starting to impact so much in our lives.
Let's transition. That's a good transition to some of the capacity building that's necessary, because we've seen very large companies come about building all that capacity, building the technical talent, building the computer systems, developing those algorithms. But when you start to look at that industry, there's a few really dominant players that are starting to have that capability and many others that really want it and maybe can't get it as easily. How do you start thinking about governance from a broader perspective at the national level and even at the regional level to make sure that it's not just a couple companies that retain all that top talent, but start to actually push it down into a lot of other industries, a lot of other maybe less profitable industries and other public good areas? How do you start to do that?
Whenever I think about this question, I think in terms of, when it comes to capacity for AI, I think in terms of this tripod of three things, and this is not going to be a surprise to any of you who work in this space. Data, compute, and talent. These models work on large amounts of data. Whoever collects the most amount of data sits in the treasure trove. I'm not going to use the data is the new oil. I just did, but yeah, you get the point. There's also compute. Compute is an interesting one because lots of firms are incentivized to provide compute at scale to everybody else, so sell it as a service. So I don't know if that's a bottleneck, but maybe it might be for certain types of highly intensive modeling. Talent is the one that I think kills a lot of companies. You have these, and maybe it'll change over the next 5-10 years, you have these superstars who are AI experts being trained in some of the best labs in the world, going to specific companies because those specific companies can actually offer them the highest amount of compensation they can get anywhere else. And so it's hard to keep your talent if you're either getting poached at higher rates for the companies. I do want to point out that it may not be as simple as, oh, you have to democratize in the stance of democratization, because I want to bring up this example because somebody brought it up to me and I think it's a very good example. Think about natural language processing models. Natural language processing models have gone through a revolution in the past 5 years, or maybe 3 years, with transformers and BERT. Not many companies who want to be able to process natural language have the capacity to build this state-of-the-art natural language processing models. And what has happened is that these large companies that have a monopoly on large data, large compute, and exclusive talent, they have built models that anybody else, like a lab, an under-resourced lab in Africa, in Asia, can use to power their own NLP pipelines. So I want to add a little bit of nuance there. It's not so much that there's a hoarding that's happening that is always bad. Sometimes that hoarding brings out benefits that can be distributed beyond the hoarders.
So let me jump on sort of the tripod that Ashande just described, the talent, the resources, compute, and data. I am cautiously optimistic, actually, on all these points, in the sense that talent is in short supply. That is no surprise, I think, to anyone. I am cautiously optimistic that as we align AI with mission, whether it's sustainability, whether it's public health, whether it's something else, that will attract the talent that we need to these areas on the basis of mission. It's not just the companies that pay the most, basically. On the question of compute, the way we do things right now is very, very intensive. It's deep learning. We brute force our way through training these models is effectively what we're doing. And I don't think in the long term this is scalable. This is not the sort of approach you're going to be able to use to solve problems all around the world. And again, speaking more with a technologist hat on, I suspect there will be a shift, and there needs to be a shift to small data models. It would still be a lot more data than we've ever used in the past, but it will be a different approach. And there's nothing that says it could not be the developing world or researchers there that develop these approaches. And so, yes, compute is a problem, data is a problem in the short term, maybe in the midterm, but AI has evolved since 1956, and the next evolution, I think, will move away from the big data approaches to something more scalable.
Can I just, on the point of talent, I think one of the things that I'm a little bit concerned is when we look at talent, we still speak to it from a very Western concept. AI is going to impact it's going to impact global North and global South. And I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of talent, the data scientists, machine learning engineers, are still being produced in what we consider global North. And so I think it's very important, and again, I don't necessarily have a solution to this, but we have to recognize the idea, this whole concern that it'll be good to have more diverse communities, producing the next generation of data scientists. Because again, if this is going to impact the future of work, the future of living, you don't want to live in a world where Palo Alto, California-based companies are the ones, and again, from a United States perspective, we want to lead the world globally, in innovation globally, but we also want to make sure that it's a sustainable world. So we have to be in a situation where there is talent from all corners of the world that is being trained, and it does take a generation to raise that. So those of you who are in education, who are looking at STEM, the importance of making sure that universities all over the world are producing data scientists, not just in North America and in Western Europe or Eastern Europe, is critical, or just in a few schools in South Asia or China. Because again, if this is the world we're living in, we all have to speak that vocabulary. And that's a long-term commitment we have to make. And I think it's a responsibility, by the way, for big companies. They can invest in some of those efforts. I know some US major companies have done a great job setting up academies, doing fast-track training. All of that can be done, but we have to be intentional about this.
Let me pick up on that a little bit. Small curveball here. We've talked a lot about STEM in other forums, and this has come up again here. And a lot of times our minds go right to the university systems and higher education, but we also see industry starting to develop those particular skill sets and trying to teach them for their own, uses, frankly. How big a role will that be playing in the future when it comes to this general space? Because when we start to talk about the global North and global South, it's very easy to say those words. It's really hard to translate one into the other and actually build those skills. Is there a different model that's necessary in order to get everyone up to speed on these things? I think Oshande's got some things to say after Catherine.
Being an anthropologist, representing the social sciences here, absolutely thinking about a diversity of perspectives at the table. And this picks up on Dilarwar's point about ensuring that we've got full representation in who is developing these technologies, right? So I'm butting up against this day in and day out in my current role, where I'm working with engineers and really trying to get them to understand and take a human-centered approach to AI. And that comes from bringing in that diversity of perspectives, because not only, as Ashande talked about, we're talking about bias in data and how that can relate to fairness and equity, but also if we introduce bias at the point at which the technology is even being conceived, then we've got it all the way throughout. So I would say it's not only building up STEM and STEAM capacities, but also thinking about bringing in a diversity of perspectives to inform the development of these technologies.
I'm going to add to this and say, I think on the question of talent and training, when it comes to AI, we are not at equilibrium, and a lot of the pain we are seeing is now because we are in this very churning moment. I don't know if lifelong learning in the context of companies is going to be the way we get from where we are to equilibrium. It depends on how easy it becomes to train people to do AI. Maybe there's an abstraction of the idea of AI that makes it easy for less intensive preparation to actually work with that. I am not sure quite yet. The only one thing I want to add to the workforce and talent problem is immigration. The effect, the usefulness of migration policy at figuring out this talent question. Part of the reason why we have some of the best AI developers, the best AI companies in the United States is because of migration policy. People come to the United States to come to our best universities, and the companies pay them money to stay, and they have the H-1B process that gets them to stay. Canada is wising up to this. Canada is making it easier for people with high talent, especially in the AI realm, to migrate over there and stay. So I think going forward, as we try to get to equilibrium on the AI talent question, we are going to be seeing jurisdictions, fractured jurisdictions across the world, using migration policy to try to sort of tweak that a little bit.
Let's go back to rules and regulations. I know we've had a little bit of back and forth on this already about the role that governments play in regulating AI. And I'm really talking about setting up certain guardrails for its use so that we don't actually fall into the pitfalls of the perils that we've discussed previously. And that balance between governments doing that kind of thing and industry taking it upon themselves. And a lot of that's not been decided, and there's actually quite a few different ways, different regions of the world have been taking this. How should we start thinking about the balance between regulations that come from governments, top down, or bottom up, industry-led regulations?
My view on this is, we talk about AI as very broadly, but AI is a catch-all. At the end of the day, we're building applications. We're building products. And AI happens to be the technology in the medium. In my previous company, we built models that helped insurance companies manage risk better. So I think instead of looking at AI as a whole and coming up with a plethora of regulation, we should look at what is the impact of a product in a certain area and what we should be watching out for. And there are some areas that clearly are critical. We know that global security is important. We can all agree on one thing, that we don't want weapons of mass destruction, right? That we can say this is off the table, period. But there are other areas in healthcare where obviously there's privacy issues, there is, effect on human health and so forth. And I would recommend that we have that lens as opposed to, a broader AI lens and looking at the industry, looking at the applications and see, just like we've seen with the earlier generation of applications, what the impact is and see whether there needs to be regulation at the government level or at the local level. I'll give you one example. In the United States, for example, AI models are not necessarily permitted to underwrite an insurance plan end-to-end because of the bias it induces. Now, it makes sense, right? And so now as we build more, we realize that sometimes we are introducing racial bias. So you have to be very, very careful. So it kind of, working backwards, that might be one approach to look at.
So I think there is a role for governments, there is a role for industry, and I think there is a role for the technologists and the developers who are developing these technologies also to play in this. At the end of the day, technology in itself is not good or bad. It's about the what, the why, the how, the what purpose. So in that sense, I agree that the legislation should be nuanced. It should take into account the use cases. It should be grounded in an understanding of the technology, and it should be aligned with certain core principles that I think I see sort of popping up. Things to do with sort of ensuring the tech is performant, is safe, is secure, ensuring some degree of transparency, ensuring data governance, privacy assurance, anonymity as needed, ensuring some degree of oversight, human oversight, again, as specific to the application. But I also want to point out that if we think of legislation, if you will, as the stick that governments can deploy, they also have carrots to deploy. And that is resources that they can allocate towards research, towards making compute available across the board, towards transitioning from research to commercialization and so on. So there are both carrots and sticks, I think.
My focus is a bit more on multilateral institutions as opposed to individual governments. And again, this is coming from the public health and global health security lens that I walk around the world with. But you know, if we think about it, AI is simply a tool, and it's really what we end up doing with the information that it provides that will ultimately make the impact, the desired impact. So if we're thinking about something like, say, digital epidemiology, deep phenotyping of emerging diseases, biosurveillance, that's entering into a system where we already have regulations, say the international health regulations, which were ostensibly bolstered in 2005, but we've seen several offenses and slippages that have gone without any sort of penalty by several nations, even though there's a requirement to, say, report an emerging disease. So my point is, let's say that we've got increased biosurveillance leverage through AI. What would actually change if we continued to have regulations set through multilateral institutions that don't have teeth, right? That don't necessarily have the power to actually make that change. So I would think more about the implications at a global scale and how we, through our multilateral institutions, are going to hold ourselves accountable.
Can I? The last point I'll add is I tend to think about regulation in terms of two things. I trust companies to do what companies do. They seek their profits as a rough approximation. And the goal of government, at least good government, is to enact the will of the people. This is important because when we talk about regulation, it starts from a point of what are the values upon which you're regulating. And companies may not always be incentivized to enact those values. And so the role of government in this space, I think, is to set out what are the principles that they're going to try to assure for every company that does AI in their jurisdiction, and then have some competent way of having companies adhere to that. I fully admit the enforceability question. That's important. If you have rules that nobody can enforce, you're in trouble. This sounds abstract, but let me try to make it more clear. I think GDPR was a good example of a jurisdiction setting out the rights they think their citizens should have. It might not have been as good at determining exactly what that means in practice, but I think that's the role of government, figuring out what they think their constituents should have as a right, and then trying to enforce that through regulation on companies. Because companies are always going to be, as I said, by default, chasing profits, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing.
AI has changed a lot in the last 5 or 10 years. I think 10 years ago, if you had said, well, we'll try to regulate it, I think a lot of people would sort of glaze eyes and not have any idea how to do that. But nowadays, we're learning a lot more about these algorithms, even work by some of the folks on the panel here about how biased is it? How bad is the data? You know, what are the problems it's creating? And we can actually start asking those questions and actually coming up with tailored answers to say, well, actually, it's okay, or it's actually really good, or actually it's terrible, folks. And I'm wondering, are there certain models you could imagine for regulation that take into consideration what Danielle's talked about, you know, maybe there's just a little bit more transparency, a little bit more information about these things that are going on out there before you start to actually regulate them, just to try to get information out to people so they're making good decisions and know what's happening. Are there certain models that exist out there right now that you could imagine trying to apply to this entire space that kind of balances this very subtle sort of industry wanting to adopt best practices, at the same time government wanting to make sure they take care of people? Anything come to mind, Oshande, from the conversation we had last night?
This is what happens when you're drinking and talking about AI. Okay, so here's the thing. I think part of the problem is when you try to regulate technology as complex as artificial intelligence, and you're doing it from the perspective of, say, DC, you don't necessarily have all the talent that helps you think through what are the right regulations. And so we need a multi-perspective view of how to actually legislate. A couple of models come to mind. There is the non-binding standard setting, like the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that the United States has. Their entire goal is to come up with best practices, like vetted best practices that they can recommend that an industry take on without enforcing it. I think that's a good way to do things because it's a good way for some aspects of regulation. But the other models that might be relevant, I think, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, where they're essentially looking to see, make sure that companies are making their products safe for users, and when they claim things about what's in the food or in the drugs, that it actually does, it's actually what's in there. So we can come up with nice to have properties on AI. We want it to be accountable, we want it to be transparent, we want it to be fair, and have an agency with enforcement power like the FDA sort of actually enforce that. The downside of the FDA model is that FDA is food and drugs, AI is everything.
Can I just jump in on this one? Applying existing models on within, let's say, the West to say, let's make it better, that's nibbling around the edges. What concerns me more, quite frankly, is that AI is impacting pretty much the entire world, including places that don't have democracy, that are not democracies. I cannot think of a technology in modern history where the benefit to human society and human living is as tied to a democratic order, when it comes to AI. Here is why. Because unlike anything else, if you control the data, you control everything. We are concerned about companies controlling the data. Imagine governments, large governments, without any adherence to standards that are globally, universally accepted to responsibly design and deploy AI, having the level of control. So I totally agree with Shantanu. There are models we can borrow from the food industry, but I think the bigger concern is we haven't figured out how to make sure that we respect human rights, we respect privacy, we respect dignity for all beings in a world where a government-owned models and access to data and absolutely lack of transparency can wreak havoc. And that's what something I hope that this forum could become an opportunity for us to think about. How do we prevent that from happening? And again, I'm saying this from point of view of partnering to see how we figure things out, not to call anyone out per se, but it is an important topic in the year 2022 that we need to begin to think about before it's too late.
So I wholeheartedly agree, Delaware, with that point. It's a really poignant point as well, but if we think about what sort of the underpinnings of democracy is education and engagement, and I am looking around and feeling as though there's sort of, at least in my own country, people feel sort of woefully unprepared and lacking in terms of digital literacy writ large. I think 10 years ago, Chris, you asked that question, what were we talking about 10 years ago? 10 years ago, people were still worried about killer sentient robots, and we were talking about HAL, right? This was before, I would say, AI has really seamlessly seeped into almost every aspect of our day-to-day lives. And yet, people can neither explain it, they can't describe it, they're afraid of it in some ways, but don't realize that it actually is something that they can learn. So in terms of models, I think what we can do is actually learn from a mistake of the past, or a miss, which was in social media and the internet writ large, and how we actually use that massive force responsibly. So if we just think about how are we going to actually continue to understand and use AI in our daily lives, think about it as a tool, as a decision support tool, what we'll do if we free up time and energy from those technologies, what are the new sort of job possibilities that we can imagine. But as long as we're sort of stuck in this digital illiteracy, we can't necessarily envision those possibilities. So that's what I would like to see more of.
I think it's also important to remember we don't live in a homogeneous world, and there are cultural norms across the globe that basically shape how people think about technology or how people think about situations. And we've seen that come up in the context of the pandemic, where different groups of people, different cultures are more or less tolerant of mask mandates, of vaccine mandates, of other restrictions on movement, and so on. And I think this will all also play a role here. At the end of the day, you know, it's a very fluid environment. The technology is still evolving. People's reactions to it are still evolving. The economy remains a global economy, and we need to figure out how to play in it, basically, and adapting to all sorts of cultural norms as well.
Can I add to that? So this multiplicity of cultural norms, I think, is going to be important for us. And I think, let's start with the example Dilara brought up about when weapons of mass destruction were a thing, an important thing. We figured out as a globe that we cared about not dying, and we figured out ways not to make that not happen. I think when it comes to AI, we might have to at least start from figuring out what are the shared cultural norms, the shared values we have, and this is actually a good forum for this, as a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder environment, figure out what we care about and come to agreement on that, because the set of things we don't care about, regulation-wise, are pretty large. So let's start with the one we know.
Did you want to follow up? Okay. We've got a couple minutes left here, and a lot of the discussion this morning from our various speakers, we're talking about practical solutions, you know, moving to actually act nowadays in a lot of these different areas we've been talking about all day today. And I'm wondering if you could think of an example of a policy, regulation, something that you'd like to see in the next couple years that you think will really help in the AI space, and one that you are really concerned might be enacted and might actually stop movement in the AI space.
I would just double down on my point on talent. I think it's crucial that we level the playing field from all corners of the world. So any one of you in this audience who is responsible for education policy, let's invest in those now. And you know, the US can be a partner too. We have incredible assets there to deploy. This is a shared technology and is something that we have to build in our collective image, given just the impact it will have on every single human being on planet Earth.
In terms of what I would like to see happen, I would like to see more technologists in the policymaker seat and also in the investor seat. I don't see enough people like me around. What I am concerned about is blanket bans that are driven out of fear, perhaps not grounded in the technology, and they're well-intentioned, aiming to guard against the worst uses of technology, but instead blunt us in the development of the good uses of technology. So that concerns me.
That's a hard question. In terms of what I think is important to happen with AI going forward, I think, and I strongly believe this while I worked at the Rowan Corporation and while I work where I am, I strongly believe that it's important for governments to become to learn to use artificial intelligence to see better their problems and to make more efficient decisions. I will keep going back to the pandemic example. We use data and artificial intelligence to predict COVID trends, and we can also use these models to predict, subject to the values of the local population, what types of interventions are most warranted. In terms of fears, I think I'll come back to equity. I don't see enough happening to blunt the rift, the widened rift between folks who benefit from AI currently, most in the global north, and folks who are whose data are being used to enable these models, but who are not really reaping the benefits of these models. So it'd be nice to maybe see examples of more small data models that make a difference in the global south, more investment in applying artificial intelligence technologies within vulnerable contexts, the context of vulnerable populations. But again, I worry about that because that application comes with its own sensitivities, but it's something that is probably important to try to get right.
A concrete, practical step that we can continue to take, a lot of these things are already in progress, is with respect to data privacy regulations. Shande mentioned GDPR. The FTC is on this as well. But this is something that we can continue to get in front of, especially as we think about personal data as it pertains to models. So that's something in the immediate that I would absolutely recommend. And then I think what can sort of prevent AI applications from truly being actualized is just a sloppy implementation where we're not actually adjusting a system to achieve the desired effect, be it in public health, in precision medicine, in financial equity and opportunities and commerce, et cetera. If we don't sort of think about the other links in the chain that are going to decide whether or not we're going to achieve that action, we miss the mark, and then we lose our trust in these technologies where we shouldn't be.
This has been great. I really appreciate the four of you taking your time to answer these questions. I know I've learned a lot. Let's thank our speakers. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'm sure some of them will stick around if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you.